Good morning. Let me start by expressing my gratitude for the opportunity to address this audience. Good Arguments, which I hear has become a luxury good around these parts, is a book about my education. It's a collection of the lessons I owe to my teachers, and it's a record of the transformations that visited me in the spaces, classrooms, dining halls, and dorm rooms that each of you helped to bring to life. So thank you for being here, and thank you for the work that you do. Now, not to ruin the surprise, but I transformed from a student to a graduate student, which is kind of like going from a pumpkin to a less fresh, older pumpkin. When I was 8 years old, I moved from South Korea to Australia without speaking English. Are there people in the room who've done a similar move across countries, across borders? When I did that, I learned that the hardest part of crossing language lines was adjusting to real-life conversation, and that the hardest conversations to adjust to were disagreements. That was when the rhythms of ordinary speech started to break down, when people's facial expressions stopped matching what was coming out of their mouths, and everyone started to interrupt. Now, Australians struggle with pronunciation at the best of times, but in arguments it becomes quite impossible. The vowels tend to swallow up the ers and the ahs, whole words and sentences. I sensed then too what a lot of newcomers to a place do, which is that their welcomeness is conditional. It's conditional on not rocking the boat too much or raising one's voice too loud. I felt then that drawing attention to my differences from my peers would mark me out as an outsider and unsettle any foothold of belonging I had been able to achieve. And so I learned to smile, to nod, and to keep most of my thoughts to myself. And though I believed then that I was alone in living in that silence, I've since come to see it as a common refuge of many people. Each of us, when we move to a new neighborhood or to a new school or go to a gathering where we don't know very many people, we tend to become very agreeable. What broke me out of this posture of conflict aversion was a promise that my 5th grade teacher made me, which was that on the debate team, when one person spoke, no one else did. And to someone who was used to being spoken over and spun out of conversation, that promise of attention sounded irresistible. And so I signed up. The topic of that first debate was that the government should ban all zoos, a subject on which I'm sure you all have strong feelings. I was assigned to speak first, and I spent weeks preparing for the debate. I wrote and rewrote my speech, practiced in the mirror, and developed powerful feelings about the welfare of leopards. And on the day of the debate, I walked up onto the stage in my school auditorium, the spring rain falling on the roof above my head, forming a kind of percussion. And I was so nervous. It was the kind of nerve that fills you up with gas, so that you squeak and you honk a little as you walk. But somehow I managed to start speaking. And when I did, I looked into an audience not dissimilar to this one, and I started to notice all these small changes. I saw a wince of recognition in the corner of someone's eye. I saw another person unfold their arms. I saw a third turn to the person next to them and say, "Are you hearing this?" And the world, which had until then seemed to me frozen in place, hard surfaces around which I would have to fit myself, that world seemed to soften. And I began to think that through the power of language and speech, I could not only survive the world, but be in conversation with it too. That feeling for a 10-year-old was pretty heady, and I was all in. As I progressed through middle and high school, I discovered a dirty secret about debate. That though the activity is often accused of reducing disagreements down to a matter of win or loss, as a competitor, you're mostly going to lose. The World Championships in debate has 500 teams competing and one winner. So you're most likely, and I was, in the 499 pretty much all of the time. I know now that that experience teaches you that humility matters, especially when you're sure that you're right. I know that that experience teaches you there's a difference between being correct and being persuasive. But none of that would have been much consolation for me back then. For much of my early debate career, the experience of defeat had a face, and that face was the face of Deborah Freeman. Deborah, a student at a rival school, was a slight person with masses of curly hair and braces, but to me she was like the goddess Athena, the goddess of war and intellect. Her specialty was rebuttal. And in my first audition for the state debating team, I remember sinking deeper and deeper into my chair as she cataloged with ruthless clarity my every assertion, generalization, errors of fact, and judgment. I felt I'd been caught in her braces, getting chewed out. And for days after, I looked into the mirror and I saw an assertion. But the biggest lesson I learned from Deborah came in a couple of debates when we spoke on the same team. Before the start of a debate, while I rushed to find one more reason why I was correct, I saw Deborah writing down the best arguments she could think of for the other side. In the round, while I found reasons to discount and dismiss opposing arguments, Deborah wrote down their arguments with perfect clarity and kept a perfect record of what the other side had said. And this, I realized, was the secret to her approach to rebuttal, that before she had her say, she first connected with where the other side was coming from. That was the moment that made me realize that debate, though carried out through speech, is in fact and at heart an exercise in listening. The point of argument was to make ourselves more legible to one another so that we might, through conversation, end up somewhere better than where we started. In my life, the richest reward for all that work has been friendship. When I arrived at Harvard for college, I ran into Fanele, a brilliant mercurial rival from the Kingdom of Eswatini with whom I'd competed on the international debate circuit, and we agreed to debate together. Though ours began as a working relationship, our conversations soon spilled into the rest of our days. We disagreed about everything from politics to romance, but we found a language to talk about and not around our differences. And the great triumph of our partnership came in January 2016 in a grand auditorium in Thessaloniki, Greece. This was the grand final of the World Universities Debating Championships, and the topic was that the global poor would be justified in pursuing a Marxist revolution. I was wearing a tuxedo at the time. which I would not recommend. We spoke with the voice that we'd been working on for decades, then we left it in the lap of the gods. When the announcement came back that we won the debate, Fanele and I ran out the building and down a block in the pouring rain in celebration. If I had written this book then, which was when I was first approached to write this book, it would have read as a kind of sports memoir, right? Like a stationary Rudy, or Rocky without the upper body strength. But several months after that great triumph in my life came the presidential debate cycle between Donald Trump and Hillary Clinton. And it was a moment that made me realize that debates were not only a symbol of polarization, but could be an instrument of division. That was my senior year in college. The year after that, I moved to China on a master's program that pledged to be a bridge between US and China. And at this moment of great optimism, I saw throughout the year the trade war set off between the two countries and a great chill set in. The year after that, I moved back home to Australia and I covered as a political reporter an election cycle that mirrored much of the poisonous politics I'd seen as a student back in 2016. In that moment, it became very difficult to see disagreement as anything other than a source of pain, division, and even an existential threat to the fabric that keeps our society together. I saw my generation embrace an ethic of grouping like with like. In their personal and romantic lives, talk about finding their people. And in their political lives, talk more about turning out the base than about speaking with those with whom people disagree. In the search for answers during this divisive and turbulent times, I found myself returning to my education in debate. I remembered the cost of all that conflict avoidance, a cost that manifests in one's personal life as a kind of self-betrayal, not saying what you truly believe, and in one's social life of holding everyone at an arm's length, not letting them too close lest they hurt you. And underlying all of that, a bleak pessimism about our ability as family members, fellow students, fellow citizens to do right by one another. I resolved then to write down the best lessons debate had taught me about disagreeing better, about forming a community around and not despite disagreements. I excavated the history of this activity which had trained presidents and Supreme Court justices, artists and civil rights leaders. I traced its history back from antiquity throughout the development of parliamentary democracy and through continuing efforts to perfect our democracy and our common compact of living together. I retraced the story of my education and all that it had brought me. And I settled on a thesis that at a time when bad disagreement seemed to be the problem, the opposite of bad disagreement was not agreement, but was good disagreement. And before I sent the book off to the presses, I had just one last question to ask, which is, what is a good argument? And when you're marketing a book, you tend to inch into the hyperbole, right? You want to say good arguments will change your life. It will bring you this revelatory perspective, deeper, more fulfilling relationships. I believe all that, but ultimately I settled on a more modest proposition, which is that a good argument is one in which both sides walk away feeling that they would do that again. because that's all it takes for the conversation to continue. I needed that as a newcomer to a place where I wasn't sure the society would have place for me. I needed that conversation to continue. And now as a writer, a student, a citizen, it's in that continuing conversation that I choose to place my hope. Thanks very much.